The primary source that we found is a website called Genesis Park. And this is a website that started off as a virtual organization in 1999, and it was established in New Hampshire in 2013. Their purpose is to basically show that dinosaurs and men have coexisted all throughout history, and they go against most scientific evolution theories. The creators of this website back up their claims and beliefs with biblical evidence of God's intention for these creatures. They also dive into topics like the conditions of early Earth, dinosaurs on Noah's Ark, and fossils, and they include links to debunk other questions and theories as well. And throughout this website, we very much saw evidence of an invested and passionate community, and that's also seen through their merchandise, monthly newsletters, and blogs.
Okay, and in the website, it says the Bible states that on the fifth day of creation, God created great sea monsters and flying creatures, and then that the scriptures are clear that everything was made in 6 days, and therefore dinosaurs and man came into existence at the time. These authors in the website repeatedly mention the Bible as their main source of evidence. In the section titled The Origin of Dinosaurs, they write this and conclude that because the Bible states this is the only sound answer that they can conclude, is that all life was created in 6 days by God, so humans and dinosaurs must have coexisted.
There's also another section titled Is Evolution a Fact? And in this, they include a section that aims at debunking evolution, and they start by defining what it means for something to be a scientific theory, or scientific fact, And they say that evolution, especially macroevolution, or like the ideas of molecules to man, does not meet this standard of being a fact and is rather just a theory that is not like sound. They touch on 3 main challenges, one of which is the mechanism challenge, which there's an excerpt of right here. And this one states that there is no consensus among scientists on how macroevolution works. And so that's why it is not a fact, because scientists can't agree. They also say that natural selection is tautological and inadequate for explaining certain complex traits like sexual reproduction or consciousness.
Okay, and then in that same section, the text also critiques common evidence for evolution. It claims fossil records lack clear ancestor-descendant chains, embryology evidence was fraudulent, and biogeography has been dropped. Overall, it argues evolution adapts to any data and therefore isn't reliable, and instead the source promotes intelligent design as a better explanation.
So now we're going to connect our primary source to a lot of the sociological concepts that we've learned in class. The first one is the effect heuristic, which is where conspiracy theorists rely on their close emotional ties, especially to their religion or political standpoint. In this case, definitely religion and the Bible. And in which they choose to ignore all logical thought processes when forming a conclusion or expressing an opinion, which was seen a lot in Ezrahi's claims.
Something else that ties directly to the primary source is they use a lot an appeal to authority, and that's a large central idea that is discussed a lot, and this is essentially where they say that the scripture is the main source of authority over the scientific claims, basically saying that the Bible is the only reliable source of facts, elevating it above like empirical scientific research. And this ties directly into Prasad's point about conspiracy theories and how they form within social groups to protect and validate a collective experience, also tying into general cynicism, which is a large mistrust of large institutions and associations like scientists or the government, because you have to have like a shared experience in order to really have that mistrust, because it is so far rooted within people. So those two things tie in to each other as well.
Another big one is the appeal to pathos, which is emotion. Even if a conspiracy theory is implausible, it can be still used as a rhetorical device to appeal to the emotions of a specific population, which is something that Goertzel kind of emphasizes in his writings. He talks about how the conspiracy theorists don't really look at the facts. They just kind of talk about how the information is wrong, how they're right. It's kind of a sort of fallacy meant to invoke a strong emotional response from their audience. And then they also use the evolution is just a theory trope, not a fact, which also can add on to that emotional appeal as well.
Mm-hmm. And then also we noticed how there's a lot of confirmation bias within the primary source. A lot of people look for evidence that confirms their beliefs and not challenges their beliefs, so it's easy for people to get deeper and deeper into these anti-science movements. Especially Gortzel highlights how misguided the public has become due to wide epidemic of conspiracy theories. Especially now, it's become widely known that schools and politics talk about evolution as a whole and whether or not they should be teaching it, or if they should be teaching based on more of a spiritual guide or knowledge, like what I said above. And additionally, the narrative of the primary source sets up like this kind of false dichotomy between if you're either you either believe in science or you believe in the scripture. And this mirrors a lot of like conspiratorial thinking where insiders are more enlightened and they know more than the outsiders. And also this reinforces like an in-group identity. So like I said, in the narrative or the primary source, it talks a lot about either you're a creationist or a science believer. So that's basically what we talked about with sociological concepts.
Okay, and then for our research questions, our first one is, how does Genesis Park use the Bible as an authoritative source in the place of scientific evidence? And what does this show about the importance of religion in their conspiracy beliefs? So Genesis Park consistently cites the Bible as the truth and uses it to overrule scientific evidence. This reflects what Chalkman and Perucci describe as mistrust in institutions. While they look at it in the context of people who identify as leaning more right, we know that there can be a connection between religion and conservatism. So we would want to explore this connection between religion, not just as faith or belief, but as a guiding authority in how certain evidence is accepted or rejected.
Our second research question is, what does the invention of baraminology suggest about how creationist movements substitute pseudoscience for empirical science to conform faith with biology? And this was based on the work of Zink in one of our scholarly sources. He talks about how baraminology is the idea that Noah's Ark carried only a few kind of species or baramids, and those then evolved into other species and animals. Zink shows how this functions as pseudoscience. And in Genesis Park, it's clear that they very much use the language of science, but base it on their faith and the Bible. So this research question would help to dig deeper into why, even though creationists use the language of science, they reject the evidence that comes from it.
Okay, and then our next question is, what does Genesis Park's sentiments towards the work of paleontologists/evolutionists reveal about the point at which faith is prioritized of scientific evidence? How does Ezrahi's distinction of wisdom versus knowledge explain this, and is one prioritized over the other? So Genesis Park critiques paleontologists and scientists for gaps in the theory of evolution. Ezrahi's distinction between wisdom and knowledge connects with this and helps explain how scientific knowledge is rejected when it conflicts with biblical wisdom, but we would still need to explore deeper on what the hierarchy is for creationists and what the tipping point is for what evidence is rejected and accepted.
And then our last research question is, how do creationist movements use dinosaurs as cultural tools to attract certain audiences? And what does this show about the role of excitement and nostalgia in the science and faith conflict? And this is based on Lawrence, the author of one of our other scholarly sources, who points out that dinosaurs carry cultural power and inspiration across generations. Genesis Park also taps into this through making their website dinosaur themed, and creationist movements also reflect this emotional connection. So we think that it's worth investigating how dinosaurs are used to blend entertainment and nostalgia with their specific agenda, and how it helps to make their message more appealing and marketable.
Now we will connect our primary source to our scholarly journals. The Saga of Science Denial is a peer-reviewed journal based on the overlap of religion and anti-evolution. It was written by Robert Zink in 2025, so it's a very recent journal based on our primary source. This journal speaks on how, 1, faith shapes people's beliefs of evolution based on their interpretation of evidence through the Bible and the creations of all humans and animals on Earth. And 2, people tend to harness their values based on the accuracy of empirical proof instead of scientific research, which can lead to people rejecting scientific conclusions that conflict with pre-existing beliefs or group identity. This connects to Prasad because conspiracies are often misinterpreted based on people's fake credibility, which is people's beliefs based on the Bible and how it can be interpreted. And also Trackman and Perucci, how liberals and conservatives have different views on evolution due to their own trusted political figures. It talks also about how evolutionists are more liberal in their ideas based on evolution and religion. Here are some quotes that help explain another perspective of our primary source. To teach students that Noah took dinosaurs on the ark is beyond irresponsible, and instead of encouraging creative and critical thinking, it indoctrinates them into science denial. We also see a growing public denial of science, in which, in spite of a person's lack of expertise, they deny scientific truth if it conflicts with beliefs expressed in their outgroup. And to mislead the public and taint school curriculars by suggesting that the ark narrative is biologically realistic requires replacing facts with faith, denying scientific evidence.
Our second scholarly source is a peer-reviewed piece that looks into creationism and the impact that having that information in places like museums make on people and culture. So the first quote that I have, specifically from the scholarly source, says that material record is incomplete, but the textual record, creationists argue, is intact. So in this scholarly source, they talk about Darwinism, and they're basically arguing that the material record is the fossil record, and the fact that Darwin himself brought up the fact that there are pieces in time that are missing, but he was basically insinuating that as years go on, those scientists are going to be able to fill in the gaps. So obviously, creationists are using this as their argument, saying that these fossil records are incomplete, but the Bible, even with its many translations, has always perpetuated the same ideas and beliefs, which therefore, with confirmation bias, make it more factual in a sense. So Prasad also talked about this and the fact that past knowledge of beliefs and experiences shape how someone can view information, which is very clear here. Obviously, they're using their belief system to back up that they do not believe the fossil records are intact and true. Also, with the second quote that I have from the source, that creationist museum fuels distrust of mainstream science. Obviously, of course, is talking about affirmations like Ezrahi once did. And although the museum itself is not technically mass media like a newspaper or a website, it is still perpetuating a certain idea. It is spreading information, and by creative fluidity, the museum has complete control on what they are sharing and how they choose to share it. And so therefore, when someone's in a museum, you associate museum with fact and truth. So being surrounded by this sort of information in an institution like this makes the sources feel trusted in a sense, and therefore the museum is able to push certain narratives, and they're able to be easily amplified in a sense. And then lastly, the third quote, which I think really ties back to our primary source and the overall concept that we are arguing with creationism and anti-evolution, is that these creationists believe that their beliefs on the earth was formed and shaped on their interpretation of the evidence, and they are saying that secular scientists are just as guided by their own beliefs. So as Gertzel argued, they feel that the info is misguided, and due to that, they feel like the scientists are being swayed by their own beliefs, or in this context, lack thereof. And so also with Trackman and Perucci, these two groups, the scientists and the creationists, have completely different perspectives. And the creationists are not necessarily denying science, but they are worried that the scientists have different motives, and because they do not have that belief system to back up their facts, they are not a source to be trusted. And so there's this general cynicism for scientists, archaeologists, and then institutions in general that perpetuate Darwinism and evolution.
One of the previous presentations presented this week was about climate change denialism. And even with historical and scientific consensus on basic facts, which is the definition, and it also connects to the concept of denying evolution in itself, conspiracy theorists that follow this ideology choose to confide in biblical, political, and social sources. And another connection made to evolution is the age demographic in which people are believing in this concept. Generation Z tends to be a little more supportive in terms of evolution and believing in science, but rather the older generations tend to lean more towards more conservative and less science-oriented theories. So ideological denialism was also mentioned in this presentation.
which means conspiracy theorists that follow this ideology choose to confide in biblical and political sources, which was also prevalent in evolution and denying that.